Tuesday, January 9th. The thing they never tell you about falling for someone is that while, you're deliriously happy in the moment, it's also a kind of happiness that seems embarrassing in retrospect. Heartache is finding out Santa Claus isn't real all over again. You suddenly feel retroactively foolish for having believed. My bartender looks at me like she knows. I wear the face of a man who misses someone. I'm staring into a glass that empties in precise increments, wiping the foam from my beard and resuming the downforce frown, because right now, I'm kind of a cliché, a banality on a stool that's too tall, and a jacket that gives no indication of just how cold it is outside. My notebook is right next to me, but I'm too far inside my own head to come up with anything worth reading. Lord knows it took long enough to seem superficially okay on the RCR podcast we recorded earlier in the day. And even then, I'm not even sure I'd done a very good job of seeming upbeat. I order a fourth round because, for the most part, I'm a happy drunk. I don't typically self-medicate this way, but it felt like a special occasion. The occasion of missing a person, and facing the possibility that you're only in the earliest stages of the missing. That this could go on for a very long time, to stretch out farther than your foresight would ever care to picture. It's generally worse when it's your fault, too. She didn't do anything wrong. Burning bridges in self-defense is an eventuality when a lot of new friendships and connections you make feel contingent upon something else. It ignites all those insecurities about whether someone could ever really like you for you. Like a moron, you're waiting for the other shoe to drop and ignoring the good thing in front of you because you've preordained that it can't possibly be this easy to find someone you fit with this well. So there has to be a catch, right? So you invent a catch, and then you wonder why this sort of thing keeps happening to you, as if you aren't the architect of everything that comes after. Anxiety, in its worst parts, is living under a cloud of constant expectation that your innate weirdness is a bit much, and you'll say the wrong thing, or you'll talk too fast, or you'll be misunderstood. You're going to mess it all up somehow. So you go out of your way to make sure the other person doesn't get the chance to do it first, that they don't get the chance to hurt you. And yet, living and loving is about being brave enough to get hurt in the first place. In a lot of ways, I think it's sometimes better to hurt now than later, if only to begin the process of getting over how ridiculous you feel, how small, shrinking into yourself because you refuse to just get out of your own way. So you look out the window or into an empty glass, and you miss her, because for as much as you might want to forget everything, it kind of helps to stew in it a bit, to keep things fresh. You miss her, and in some ways you know you're always going to. You're always going to be sad when you hear a certain Henry Mancini song. But look, it starts now. The process. Getting past being this person that doesn't eat or sleep, that isn't really present but isn't entirely gone either. It all starts now. You're going to be okay. And you know why? Because each morning is another chance to turn this franchise around. You've got to believe that, because you can't really keep your head above water otherwise. But tonight you can be a cliché and seek the comfort of a cold yellow. Wednesday, January 10th. I visit my grandmother. She can tell something is wrong, but I don't feel much like talking. I wouldn't even begin to know how to explain Jessica to her, so I don't. Her apartment is one of the few places I feel safe, so I bring her a sandwich, something I do for her every week, typically on a Tuesday. But I've been in such a fog of self-sustaining anguish that going anywhere feels like some Herculean task. Still, I needed to see her, so I stopped at her favorite sandwich spot and got her usual, an Italian on a soft roll with oregano, oil, and vinegar, but no peppers. We hang out and watch Caso Cerrado in the late afternoon, and for a while, I kind of forget that anything is bugging me. Caso Cerrado is a sort of Spanish Judge Judy program where Dr. Apollo adjudicates any number of different cases, some of which don't even seem to have a legal component. In Spanish, my grandmother talks shit on the scrubby-looking dude in the episode, which has to do with the daughter searching for her real father as a grown adult. She's not really looking for any sort of back child support, just a father who can be in her life. But the guy insists he's not her father, and desperately wants out of this whole mess. At least that's what I could gather from my embarrassingly rusty Spanish. I swear, I'm the worst Puerto Rican on earth. A glorified coconut, except I'm sort of white on the outside too. Doesn't mean I'm not proud of who I am and where I come from. If anything, it makes me prouder to have that connection to my roots through my grandmother and the rest of my family. Because in our culture, family is absolutely everything. In some other cultures, people have to be dragged kicking and screaming to see older relatives, but I'd be here every day if I realistically could be. In 2012, my grandmother had a stroke, and I never really thought we'd get her back. Not completely. There was a 33% chance of her pulling through from that stroke, and in the haze of that cold, gray hospital in Philadelphia, I remember thinking back on an afternoon when I was around 12 and passing by a medical supplies store where a mannequin is in traction and on a respirator. My grandmother always joked that if she ever ended up like that, to just let her go. I remember being terrified that it would come to that, and that we'd have to let her go, even though I selfishly wasn't ready to say goodbye. I remember my terror in that exact moment, and I wish I could tell that Nick not to worry, because somehow, nearly 6 years later, she's still here, sharp as a tack, helping me through my own feelings of heartache and stupidity without even realizing it. Because things could always be worse. You could be back there in that hospital, praying, bargaining, crying in front of family for whom you're supposed to be strong. I ask her if it's okay if I start chopping up ginger root to make tea, and my grandmother doesn't seem to mind. I ask if she wants some, but she's focused on the television and on her sandwich. No, papi, I'm okay. Hice un café si quieres un poco, she asks me. No, abuela, I'm all right. I'm really not, though, but I can push it out inside these four walls, at least for an hour or two. Later that day. This is the most poorly insulated gym I've ever been in. It's colder than a mother-in-law's kiss, but I don't really care. I want to yell and punch and make inanimate objects feel something. I want to assign purpose to purposeless anguish. I'm supposed to have aged out of heartache by now because I'm not supposed to care enough anymore to let it happen in the first place. I'm the keep things casual guy who doesn't want anything more because being responsible for someone else's happiness feels like an awful lot of work for everything somehow being your fault in the long run anyway. I increase the speed of the treadmill, trying to run past all of this and just skip to the part where I don't think about it anymore. Past thoughts of how much easier it must be for her, how easy I must be to forget about, to move on from because of the mistakes I've made, because of the person my doubts turned me into. That I'll be carrying this with me for a long time, whereas I find it virtually impossible to believe she isn't okay right now. That she isn't perfectly fine. Because it's easier for me to believe I never really meant that much to her in the first place than it is to believe that I wrecked things with someone who genuinely cared about me too. And you know what? That's the coward's way of thinking, because it prevents introspection from looking inward and taking into account all the shit you did wrong that caused those problems in the first place. So you stew in it a little more, because it hurts how much you miss her and how you wish you could go back to her sleepy, freezing little town and visit her and all her awesome friends, like Daniel with the quick wit and a long knowledge of Porsches, the kind of guy you can have a beer with and know that you're under no obligation to say or do anything funny, because he's got that taken care of. The guy has probably also forgotten more about cars than I'll ever know, and I hope we can find an excuse to hang out again. But for now, Daniel and Jessica are kind of a package. It's hard to think about one without thinking about the other. And suddenly you're a snake eating your own tail. God, it didn't even last that long. What the hell is the matter with you, Nick? I turn the speed up higher, huffing like my lungs are about to explode, past the sound of Blind Pilot on my phone, and past the thought of how terrifying being happy really is. Because happiness, real happiness and not just contentment, means having something to lose. An hour passes, and I'm a sweating mess. It's been about a month since I've started coming here, and every time I'm here, I'm angrier. I wonder if that's supposed to happen. I get to be angry on the treadmill. I get to use the rowing machine until my arms are about to fall off. In a cold, empty gym in January. This is what my insecurities have bought me. Thursday, January 11th. As usual, I'm far too excited for the Oscar nominations coming. It's just a weird quirk I picked up from a childhood of watching movies with my mom. I take my grandmother her sandwich and pretty much talk her ear off about movies I've seen, like The Shape of Water. I try to find a diplomatic way to tell her what it's about without actually going into how it's a love story between a mute woman and a fish. Then again, it's basically just Beauty and the Beast anyway, and I tell her so. Her birthday is around the corner, and I think maybe it's something she might enjoy seeing, just for the novelty of trying to make heads or tails of it. Her English is great, so it's not a matter of her understanding it or not, but more seeing how she interprets what's basically a modern fairy tale from a Latino filmmaker. And besides, we've been out to see far more provocative movies as a family, so this hardly seems like it would be in violation of some puritanical notion of taste that she doesn't even hold. She seems interested in possibly going out, just not right now. She's tired a lot, so I ask if it's okay if I make tea, and she doesn't mind. I show her some new pictures of her grandkids, since I saw my nephew over the weekend. Él se parece a su pai? Yeah, he does look like his dad. I realized partway through that the only movie she's seen in theaters this year was Coco, which we all saw together, as a family. She, my mom, my niece and nephews, my sister, my brother and his girlfriend, we all went together and we were all a mess at the end of it. Mostly because of the song Remember Me, an ode to lost family and the comfort that those we're missing are always with us. It's a gorgeous song, and I tell her it's pretty much guaranteed to be up for the Best Original Song Oscar. We talk about whether they'll do the Spanish version or keep it in English as Caso Cerrado comes on. It's the most normal I've felt in days. She smiles at me for no particular reason and then tells me how fat I'm getting, and I joke that I'm already way past the getting part. And besides, I'd say, now we're both slow, but for different reasons, and we'd have a laugh about it because this is the kind of relationship our family has. I hand her the walker I got her as a Christmas present 2 years ago, the one with the flashlight built in, so she can come lock the door behind me as I go. I have to hurry since my gym is weird and closes at 8 p.m. I tell her I love her and recede down the hallway quickly, hearing the lock and catching the faint smell of arroz con gandules. I spend an hour at the gym. Then I go do an open mic night and talk to my friend Brad about my heightened anxiety about the impending New Zealand trip. It's just par for the course for my anxiety, really. I was nervous about the Colorado trip, the Southern Stab, the Pacific Fister, even RCR UK. I'm nervous about everything because that's kind of what life is like for me. This constant state of formless dread. The phrase, "I've got a bad feeling about this," made manifest, and I realize it's time to play, even though I'm not finished with the whiskey ginger in front of me. I figure the ice cubes will have watered the entire thing down by the time I'm done, but whatever. I play this lonely-sounding song by Troye Sivan, while the snow peppers the ground outside the window to my back. I pound out my 4 minor chords of Cliché and go into something a little more up-tempo. Touch by Little Mix, because I'm not really one for feeling shame anyway. My drink sits on the table, sweating like a mobster at Sunday dinner after whacking a made man, and I wish I'd brought it up with me. After my set, I don't feel much like talking, so I head to the bar down the street that still serves food past midnight. They generally have the best burgers in the city, and you get a deal on a beer if you buy the burger. Almost as soon as I walk through the door, I run into Shelley. Shelley and I had been pretty close over the summer, a friendship that turned into something more, before shrinking back into a friendship when I didn't want to take the next step. Of course, the irony isn't entirely lost on me, but here we are. I had seen her a few weeks earlier, and we talked about making plans in that way adults do when they fall out of touch. The circular vow to set something up for the future, but knowing that the best you'll be able to do is to run into each other by surprise in random places such as these. More often than not, it was me coming up with some kind of excuse for why I couldn't come out. But just as frequently, it was simply that I didn't want to. I had work to finish, and RCR stories to write and record and edit. I still cared about her, even though the nature of our relationship had changed. I have no idea how she felt about me anymore, but, well, it had been the better part of 6 months, but I did miss hanging out with her and generally just shooting the shit, so it was a pleasant surprise to see her again. We split a burger and fries, and she talked to me about how her son had been doing since I had seen him at her sister's wedding a few months earlier. I'd been her last-minute date, and I remember being so stoked about it because I get a kick out of any opportunity to wear a suit. She also told me about her new boyfriend who sounded like an alright guy, but then every guy sounds like an alright guy when the relationship is brand new. We were both pretty faded, so I started telling her about Jessica, about how embarrassingly infatuated I became, despite fighting every instinct not to be, and how part of me wonders the extent to which I mistook lust for something greater than whatever it was we actually had, if you could say we had much of anything at all. I told her how much I missed going to her town, how much I enjoyed hanging out with all of her amazing friends, and how comprehensively I'd ruined the whole thing with my insecurities. I also made the mistake of telling her I'd have changed my entire anti-relationships rule for Jessica, which was probably a lousy thing to say to Shelley in retrospect. But I don't think she could have possibly cared any less, or if she did, she didn't show it. So I hoped covering the tab for the night would be the absolute least I could do, in the event I'd hurt her feelings. I went to go take a leak, and when I came back out, she had left. I texted her to ask where she'd gone, and she noted her ride had shown up and she had to bolt. But she talked about how great it was to see me, and we promised to hang out again because Lord knows I'd already taken one person for granted this month, and I didn't plan on making a routine of it. I finished my burger and beer and called a Lyft, and then I go home to try and sleep through recurring dreams about closure. Wednesday, January 17th. The pressure is mounting as New Zealand gets closer, and the new RCR stories isn't done. I really wanted it to be done before we left, and I have exactly 7 days to make that happen, since we're leaving on Thursday the 25th to stay overnight at a hotel near the Philly airport, then catching an early flight to LA on Friday, spending a day there, and then heading onward to Auckland, hoping things go well. But as I continue writing, I realize parts of the DeLorean story are out of order, so I have to essentially rearrange the narrative before recording it. I find myself recording the narrative into the late afternoon, and by the end, I'm left with a 2-hour audio file that I have to edit down into something manageable. Shelley texts me to see if I wanted to follow up on that promise to grab a drink. Part of me is sick of staring at a computer. Part of me just wants to get out. But there's still too much audio to edit, too many breaths and bad takes to remove, and not enough time to get this video done before New Zealand. And I'd had a beer or two the night before and didn't really feel like drinking again, so I text back to Shelley that I'm busy. She writes, "As usual, anytime you want to drink with me, LOL. That's alright. I can take a hint." Part of me wanted to type something reassuring, but nothing came to mind. So I left the text unanswered and got back to work. Thursday, January 18th. The final touch-ups on the audio editing for this RCR story are almost done, so I take a break and pick up my guitar and try to get these lingering feelings for Jessica out of my head and onto paper, while also acknowledging that I should really be over it by now. I get 2 decent verses down when my mother calls to tell me that my grandmother has had another stroke. It actually happened the day before, but she didn't want to worry me with it in the middle of the night. And the room starts to spin a little bit. Is she going to be okay? I ask. And my mom says the doctors say she should pull through. And I ask how this happened if she was having regular checkups. Apparently, a clot formed on top of the old one and they just didn't catch it. Or maybe I'm getting the science of it wrong. I don't really know. None of this makes any sense. My ears were ringing and I could feel every cell in my body. The problems I had before just seemed so small. Jessica, Shelley, this stupid fucking song I was writing. It felt so small. This documentary about John DeLorean too. Just everything minuscule in relation. Her birthday had been a day or two earlier and I hadn't been to visit because I wanted to work on the documentary and figured, oh, I'll take her dinner on Friday and we'll watch Perry Mason. I figured it would all be okay because it never really occurred to me that it wouldn't be, even though part of me had been expecting something like this for years. And yet, the first week I don't visit and this happens. It's always just been me, my mother, and my aunt who visit her every week. We were the ones keeping her in contact with other people, hanging out with her, paying her bills, and keeping her affairs in order. And it's not because the extended family didn't love her too. They did, and they came to visit whenever they could, but they're farther away, and we're the ones who were nearby. We were the ones who fretted over everything about her, who took care of her, who made sure she wasn't alone in this world, even if the wider world was something shrinking from her reach in her condition. I just missed 1 week. It's not fair. But then I imagine it's not supposed to be, which, whatever. I asked my mother if I can visit, and she says I can, but she wouldn't really recommend it, if only because my grandmother probably wouldn't have wanted me to see her in the state she was in. They're doing another operation, she says, and then after that would be better. And I linger on the words. Not good, but better. I think back to the medical supply store window, and my mother tells me there's nothing I can do right now by going over there and worrying. And, I don't know, maybe she's right. Sunday, January 21st. I feel like a zombie. I haven't gotten any work done in a few days. Hell, I haven't even started packing for New Zealand. I pick up food from the Puerto Rican restaurant near my mother's house and bring it over so we can watch a movie. We're about an hour into the film with both of us trying to keep our minds off of everything when I get a text notification. Yo, man, Shelley is dead. I almost put the phone down and just went back to the movie. In a very cliche, almost Hollywood way, it seemed so utterly ridiculous on its face that it didn't even register. But as I stare at the words, I feel as though I can see the reality through them, like an optical illusion that you stare at for just long enough to see the picture but not truly take it in. I feel like I'm falling through the couch. My stomach is in knots, and then those knots are in my throat. I want to cry. I want to have that power. When I heard about my grandmother's second stroke, I couldn't muster it then, and I can't muster that for Shelley now. I'm too dizzy. My breathing, my friend didn't know much about Shelley and I. He just knew that we knew each other and had heard through the grapevine that she had passed away 2 days earlier. And if he'd known, I feel he might have called rather than texted, but I'm not sure I would have appreciated a call any more than a text. In a text, I can keep my reaction to myself. No one has to hear it on the other end. I'm not crying, but I can't stop, I don't know, breathing? The breathing. I take a Klonopin, and I try to stay focused on the movie. Of course, like a moron, I go on Facebook. A mutual friend has a picture of her on their profile, and that's when it suddenly becomes real. And I think back to that text, the last words we ever exchanged. That's all right. I can take a hint. She's going into the ground thinking I didn't care about her. And maybe that's fair. Maybe I didn't care enough. That I was so self-absorbed that I couldn't see past my own problems. All I want is for this not to be true. That we could go have a beer and I could listen to her complain about some clueless ex-boyfriend hitting her up, even though they hadn't spoken in years. That we could talk about her amazing tattoo she was getting done, that was already half finished, that was half a scene from one of my favorite video game series. One of our favorite video game series. The movie ends and I decide to call it an early night. I stay at my mother's house and I nod off, dreaming about Shelley, but also about my grandmother. And about Jessica, too. People I miss. People I'm going to. Monday, January 22nd. I go to Brian's to record a new episode of the RCR podcast. I tell him about Shelley and about that last text. No, man, you can't dwell on that. You didn't do anything wrong, he tells me. And I know he's right. It'd be vanity to think otherwise. He asks if I even want a podcast today, considering, and I insist I'll be fine, but in reality, the only reason I'll be fine is because of the chat room, because of the people, the interaction, work, the things that have nothing to do with the hurt. The podcast goes well as we talk about UFC, and I offer my reviews of The Shape of Water, which ended up being a far more affecting and emotional movie than I was expecting. You see, I talk about all of this on the podcast, and I can almost see it going through one ear and out the other on the live chat, and I wish I could be more succinct. Like, even now, I don't know why I'm including this part, but my natural tendency is to ramble, to start saying things before I know what I'm saying. It's one of my many bad habits, but hey, the podcast is still fun to do, and as time passes, I feel as though I'm getting slightly better at it, at adding to the conversation, at not letting the problems show. And even if I weren't getting better at it, I sort of needed this today. For about 90 minutes, I get to forget about things, and I appreciate that viewers put up with it. Wednesday, January 24th. My nervousness about RCR New Zealand is steadily mounting. This is the farthest I've ever been from my family, and the longest amount of time I'll have ever been gone, not counting being away at college. And that hardly even counts, considering state college is only a 2.5-hour drive from anything that might happen. But even if I weren't family-oriented, it's just my natural inclination to be nervous about a plane ride lasting into the double-digit hours, over an ocean as expansive as my imagination's capacity for conjuring dread. Having recently spoken with him, Brian seems totally okay. Back in the fall, when I told him about how anxious I would get in the weeks leading up to any RCR trip, he seemed genuinely surprised that it was even possible for a person to live this way. Hell, I kind of am too. I feel lucky that through therapy, good friends, a close family, and a job I love, I've been able to come as far as I have. And you know, what's funny is that I always end up enjoying the trip in the long run. I always end up being fine. And when I'm home, I always end up wishing I were back where I was. But it's the anticipation that gets to me. It's the mind swimming with possibilities turned towards some dread purpose, and the notion that no one will understand what's happening to me and simply think that I'm crazy. It's also the recognition that, as a result of the trip, I won't be able to go to Shelley's funeral. Our friend circles didn't really overlap much, save for a small handful of people, and all I can think is that once I see her there, I just don't want to break down in front of strangers. I don't know why. It's not like anyone was ever judged for crying at a funeral. But I wish I could be there and somehow be strong enough not to cry. But the New Zealand ticket is paid for. Everything is booked. I can't meet Brian later. But then maybe that's just a cop-out on my part. I don't know. I'm a grown-ass man. International travel shouldn't be that hard. And yet, I can't imagine doing it alone. And so I finish my packing, knowing that I'll be missing the chance to say goodbye to a friend. But first, I go to my bank and I do the only thing I think I can, and I write a check to her little boy's trust fund, because my mother is my best friend and I couldn't imagine what my life would have been like if I had to grow up without her. I drop it off at the bank in charge of the trust fund, with a certain measure of guilt that this is all I'm choosing to do. And it is a choice, but it feels like the least and the most that I can do. Thursday, January 25th. My packing is finished for New Zealand, and I'm in those pre-departure jitters. Brian is coming to get me by 6:30, and it's already 10 of 6. I worry about what will happen with my grandmother while I'm gone, if they'll have to put her in her home, or if she'll be able to rehab and return back to her old apartment. I feel like I'm abandoning everybody, but over the weekend my mother insisted that I go to New Zealand anyway, since there isn't really anything I could do here just waiting around and having anxiety attacks. She seems to be the only person, not the least bit concerned that I'll have any anxiety problems overseas, and I think it's because she knows Brian will be there with me. Even if everyone thinks I'm a lunatic if I have an attack during a meet, at the very least I know Brian will get it. He'll tell me exactly what's happening to my body and ballpark about how long it'll take for it all to pass, and he'll say it with the authoritative certainty of a man telling you the color of the sky. The panic attack will be just that, an attack, a thing that will have an end as all temporary things do. I get my suitcase and backpack ready when I hear the key turn in the tumbler at the front door. I don't recall ever giving Brian a key, and it doesn't occur to me that he would ever use it if I had. It's at this point that my mother walks through the door. I can tell we need to talk. After some hellos and what are you doing here's, we get to the point. Listen, she says. We're thinking about what we might need to do about Grandma. What are you talking about, I ask. And my mother explains to me that, yes, my grandmother will probably pull through, but she wouldn't be able to talk anymore, and she might not have control of the left side of her body. She would never be able to cook again, or make coffee, or enjoy the sort of sandwiches I would take her. She wouldn't be able to do much of anything, much less leave the house ever again. Not comfortably, anyway. She's on life support, my mother explains, and we're thinking we might take her off of it. And in my childish naivete, I think, but what if she comes back? What if she's still in there? She's still in there, right? You're killing her. But I'm remembering the medical supply store and the mannequin in the window, hooked up to all sorts of machines. It was a joke then, but now, I ask my mother, should I stay? Should I not go to New Zealand? And I suddenly find that I'm starting to get choked up. When this whole thing started, I promised myself I wouldn't cry, and here I am, you know? That's up to you, my mother says. But I'm really just wishing I could be a kid again and she could tell me what to do, to just order me to stay, that my family needs me. But she knows what this trip means, that while it might not always seem that way to others, this is my job. And so I tell her, Ma, I don't know what to do. Brian's going to be here any minute. If you ask me to stay, I'll stay. It'll be hard, but I think he'll understand. I mean, he might not even really need me for this, because we have fixers on the other side who can do the camera work. And my mother cuts me off and says, Nick, it's your job. He wouldn't have gotten the ticket if he didn't need you. And you do more than camera shit anyway. Look, you should probably just go to New Zealand. We don't know what's going to happen with Grandma. We could take her off of life support and she could start breathing on her own. She might not die, but we're looking at the possibilities of what could happen. We just don't know. And so I thought about my grandmother and what she would have wanted me to do. Is the family going to hate me for not being here? My voice breaks as I say it. Why would they hate you, Nick? My mom says. Well, because I ran off. And she says, you aren't running off, Nick. They know you're working. And besides, even if you're not there and she dies, they'll know you were there while she was still here. You took care of her as best you could. And that's all you can really do. But I think it's better for you to just have whatever memory you had of her last and keep that. Because I don't think you want to go to the hospital and see her how she is now. And I don't think she'd want you to either. A minute later, I get a text from Brian letting me know he was outside. I wipe my eyes, grab my luggage, and let my mom know that I'm sorry, and that I love her, and that I promise we're all going to be okay. I don't know how, but I know that we will be. As Brian and I drive to Philadelphia, I keep comfort in the notion that she'll go in peace, that my grandmother won't have to suffer trapped in her own body, incapable of enjoying life on her own terms, that she'll leave us, but end up in a place where she's whole again, and with the children she's lost in her 83 years. And no pain, no worry will ever touch her again because, well, ella no sufrió. Saturday, January 27th. Los Angeles, California. I sit at a table in the hotel lobby with Brian as we do some light writing. Just people watching. My phone rings. It's my mother calling to tell me that they took my grandmother off of life support, but that she's breathing on her own. For a brief moment, a shameful moment, I become frustrated. On whose behalf, I don't know. Maybe on behalf of my family for the struggle that's ahead if she lives, or for my grandmother who deserved to go peacefully, or maybe even for myself for the knowledge that wherever they put her, I'm going to visit anyway, and confront the reality of her circumstances versus the woman I remembered and loved and admired. But then, you don't stop loving a person after something like this happens, and you don't stop admiring their strength when their body decides to fight. I would still visit as often as I could, because you don't abandon the people you love. But then, if that's true, why am I in Los Angeles right now? My mother explains that my grandmother is breathing on her own, but it could go either way. She might live, she might not. That's the shit of it, Nick, she says. We won't know until we know. They just have to keep monitoring her. But she assured me the family was all there, so whatever happened, she wouldn't be alone. My mother tells me not to worry, not to put so much on myself, and there's literally nothing for me to do here but worry. I don't tell her that worrying is what I'm doing anyway. She promises to keep me updated, and I remain hopeful, but I'm not even sure what it is I'm hoping for anymore. I don't want to wish my grandmother dead, but I don't want to wish her into a situation where she's still here but incapable of enjoying her life. I just don't want her to suffer. I return to the table, update Brian on the situation, and we get back to writing. The irony of it all is that I missed so much to finish that RCR stories before we left, and I couldn't even get that done in time. I guess life has a funny way of peeling back the layers on your priorities. And I don't blame the work itself, I blame myself for not being better at time management. If anything, the work is what's getting me through right now, as I write in this journal, mixing past and present tenses because my writerly brain isn't what it should be right now. I mean, when is it ever, right? I'm going to get on a plane and write for 12 hours as I cross an ocean and try to pretend I'm okay for 3 weeks. After all, what else can I really do from the Southern Hemisphere? Tuesday, January 30th. Our first 2 days in New Zealand involved just getting acclimated to our new surroundings. We get new SIM cards, and the first thing I want to do is see how my family is doing, but none of my texts appear to be going through. It's just as well, I suppose. We're a full day and several hours ahead, and I don't even have an internet connection to look up what time it is in Pennsylvania. Brian and I have been hanging with two of our fixers in New Zealand, Andrew Lamb and Isaac Blomfield of Camshaft Software, the makers of the game Automation. And they've been extraordinarily gracious in showing us around. We spend the afternoon at a place called Piha Beach, which is host to the hottest sands I've ever laid foot upon. I thought I could walk it barefoot without paying for sandals since I'd forgotten to bring any of my own, but nope. It was kind of like traversing the beaches of Mustafar, so I ran over to this little shack where a guy was selling sandals for a few bucks NZ. This girl in front of me would have gotten the last pair and I'd have been screwed, except they didn't really fit her, so she opted to pass on them. I purchased the pair and ran out to meet everybody, but couldn't see worth a damn. So I sat on a rock in the shade and looked out into the water, and to the people sunbathing or the children fighting the ocean like little Pete and Artie, the strongest man in the world, at the end of every summer. Eventually, I go out there to join, and the water is so frigid I feel preserved in a strange way, like my entire structure is changing at a molecular level each time the water slams into me and sends me flying back to linger in icy pinpricks of delight. We climb small cliffs and have a look at our surroundings as we let the sun dry us and give us sunburn. We roam in echoless caverns and witness the thoughtless revelry of dogs in shallow water. I'm in the most beautiful place I've ever been, and I'm not even in the most beautiful part of it. The sun sets and we head down to downtown Auckland for dinner, but it really just turns into an extended bit of exploration along the waterfront. I've never been much for the water, but the smell of salt rising into the air and being carried along the night breeze in summer is majestic. We find a walkway that looks like something out of Midgar in Final Fantasy VII, and Brian asks us to take a picture of him, as if he were about to get into a boss fight with the Turks, while Andrew plays the Turks theme on his phone. We inadvertently block the passage of a passerby who simply says, "Really?" as we let him through. We walk along a pier when my phone vibrates. Apparently one of my messages finally got through. It was my mother asking if I was all right. "I'm fine. How's Grandma?" A pause. I know my mother likes to save bad news until she can tell someone in person, like when my cousin was killed by a drunk driver at 17. "Just tell me, Ma. It's okay." A few more seconds. "Grandma passed peacefully yesterday morning." I stop walking, and the guys walk ahead of me, not realizing I've stopped. "I'm sorry, Ma," I write. "I'm okay," my mother responds. "She's in a better place. Please don't be upset. Just remember that she is not suffering anymore." Brian notices that I've stopped walking. The next text comes in. "Remember her the way she was." And I grit my teeth to hold it all in. Brian asks if I'm okay, and I tell him what's just happened, and he places his hand on my shoulder. A strong, firm grip, as if to brace me against my own grief. I've never been more appreciative. Andrew and Isaac both offer their condolences, good men all around. And I explain to them my guilt for feeling a dull sort of relief. I'm not happy, but I don't know that I can cry either, because I've spent so long conditioning myself not to, that I can't allow myself to let it out, because I need to be strong for my family, but my family's not here, and so who's being strong for me? And I realize that I have to be strong for myself, to believe in the me that thinks he's strong enough to handle this from the other side of the world. It's a long ride back to the hotel, which is a sweatbox in the middle of the worst part of town, which wouldn't even be in the bottom 5 worst parts of my hometown. But hey, there's a bed, so I can't complain. Except, well, there's no air conditioner, and the windows don't open all the way, and New Zealand is in the midst of a heat wave, so Brian and I stick our pillows in the refrigerator, not realizing until much later that it might have been smarter and more efficient to simply put our pillow cases in there. We take turns showering before bed, and I let Brian go first while I whip out my Kindle to get in a few chapters of Oathbringer. But my mind is somewhere else. Even in these first 2 carefree days before we actually start filming, my mind has been drifting to the things I did wrong, the people I took for granted. And really, that's the lesson in all of this. Don't get so caught up in yourself that you end up taking other people for granted. Whether that means not getting so wrapped up in your own emotions that you look right past the amazing woman you had in front of you, whether it means getting so caught up in your work that you neglect a friend who needed you, or whether it means taking for granted that you'll have more time with someone you love, when tomorrow is never really promised to any of us in the first place. Just don't fall into the trap of taking for granted your relationships, or the people at their center. Brian gets into his bed and puts his earplugs in while I hop in the shower. After I'm done, I let the water run and I stare into the wall, feeling the cold pinpricks that aren't even a third of the cold of the waters of Piha Beach. I stare at the wall, and it feels as though it's shrinking away from me, my entire world getting smaller, even as my experience of it widens. And suddenly, I'm crying, but in the way you cry in a bad Hallmark Channel original movie, because I didn't realize it at first. I'm just looking at my hands and then to the wall and then to my hands, and things get hazy and I realize that I'm crying and that it's not the water. And I sort of just let go. I miss Jessica every day. I miss her laugh, and I miss the way she walks on her tiptoes when she's not wearing shoes. Because she's so used to wearing heels, it's almost as if she forgot how to walk any other way. And I miss Shelley. I miss her smile whenever we'd catch a glimpse of each other from across the room, in a place we didn't realize the other occupied. But Grandma, I'll miss my grandmother forever. I'll miss her voice. Not just her speaking voice, but her singing voice, that beautiful operatic tone. I'll miss her strength and hope that even a fraction of it is genetic so that I can see through to the other side of this. Later on, and this is jumping ahead to the future, but my nephew tells me that my sister sang Remember Me at her funeral. The funeral that I missed. The second one in a month's time. But it was a celebration rather than a mourning. That she was at peace, that we could remember her. That the family was all there together, and that although I was on the other side of the world, they could feel me there too, in spirit. I don't know how I can be better, but I know I can try, because it's a process. I'm a grown man who doesn't feel grown, but who has to get there sooner rather than later. For my sake and for the people I love. The people I carry with me everywhere I go, because they mean more to me than I know how to say, and I don't want the time to come where I feel regret or guilt over the notion that the time I gave, or the things I did, or the words I said weren't enough. So tell your people you love them. Just tell them you love them and that you're here for them, and then try to live by the example of those words as best you can, and hope that when it's all tallied up in the grand scheme of things, that it'll be enough. And that you'll have had a life well lived, and your loved ones along with you. I have my moment in the shower, just let it all out, and leave it all swirling down the drain. And then I shut off the water and go to bed. Tomorrow, the work begins.